Okay, so we understand the Federal Reserve or the federal funds market, and that's a market for reserves or loans between banks, and it has an interest rate for those loans we call the federal funds rate. So we're going to develop a market for this, as we've done with our other key markets in class. And so there's demand for reserves in the federal funds market. So this comes from banks that need reserves. So I'm short on my reserves for the day. I think we're going to have more withdrawals than we have in reserves at the Fed to make the transfers. So I need some more. So I'm going to borrow from other banks. That's demand for reserves. And so this is pretty straightforward. So if I draw the quantity of reserves on the horizontal axis, and the price here is going to be the federal funds rate. So I'm just going to call that RF. The federal funds rate. Maybe I'll call it capital RF for the federal funds rate. And very simply, right, demand is going to be a decreasing function of the federal funds rate. So the higher the federal funds rate, the lower demand for loans is going to be. So higher RF implies a higher cost to borrowing reserves. So banks are going to keep larger and larger fractions of their deposits in reserves the higher the federal funds rate goes. So banks keep more deposits as reserves. Right? So in a world where there's no fractional reserve banking, and banks keep all of their deposits on hand as reserves, there's no need for the federal funds market. Any transactions are able to be covered by reserves the bank has. So I have all of your deposits on hand. You can transfer away, and we have sufficient funds. So the higher the cost of borrowing gets, the more banks get closer to getting away from fractional reserve banking. The lower the interest rate, the cheaper it is to borrow, the more riskier I'm going to get in that sense in terms of loaning out or using your deposits to buy other interest-earning assets. So that is the demand for reserves, decreasing function of the federal funds rate, the interest rate, or the cost of borrowing. Now, supply of reserves is ultimately going to be fixed by the Federal Reserve Bank, and we'll see how that works, right? So you may say, well, banks have different supplies of reserves, excess reserves, etc. But ultimately, the Federal Reserve Bank is going to be able to control that. And so we're going to write the supply very simply. So if I write the quantity of reserves, the horizontal axis, the federal funds rate on the vertical axis, supply is simply going to be a vertical line. The Federal Reserve says we're going to supply this amount of reserves to the federal funds market, and the Fed can remove reserves or add them as they see fit. So when we ultimately put demand in here, we'll see we have some equilibrium, which is ultimately going to determine the real interest rate, sorry, the federal funds rate. And so that is where equilibrium shows up here. So I have the quantity of reserves and I have the federal funds rate, which is the price of borrowing in this market. I have supply and I have demand, and since supply is inelastic or fixed, it's vertical, I get some RF star. And so how does the Federal Reserve decide on what the supply should be is they have a particular target for the federal funds rate. So the Fed may say we want RF to be 2.5%. That's our target interest rate. And so they're going to adjust supply to make sure that that target is always hit. So lots of things can happen. The demand for reserves may shift around, and the Fed then will respond to keep things at the target rate. So imagine that we had a 2.5% target rate, and something happened that caused demand for reserves to increase, right? So maybe banks want to make more loans. So the economy is doing really well, and people want to buy more houses. So how do I buy a house or a car? I have to get a loan from the bank. So banks want to make more loans. People want mortgages. They want to buy houses. So banks are saying more and more, we need liquidity in order to finance those transactions. The more loans I make, the more strain is put on my reserves to handle the transactions, deposit transfers. So demand is going to increase in that example, right? So what happens when demand for reserves increases? Well, if the Fed did nothing, demand increased, the interest rate would simply go up. There wouldn't be any more reserves in the system, which would mean that effectively banks are unable to increase the amount of loans they make. So since the Fed is trying to keep their target interest rate, if demand increases, the Federal Reserve Bank is simply going to increase the supply in order to keep the interest rate fixed at 2.5%. So that's what the Fed really does on a day-to-day basis, is to make sure the federal funds rate stays at its target. So if demand increases, puts upward pressure on RF, Fed increases supply in order to keep it fixed at 2.5%, whatever their target is. If demand were to decrease for some odd reason, that's going to put downward pressure on the federal funds market, or on the federal funds rate. And so the Fed then is going to decrease supply in order to counteract that, right? So if demand was to decrease, the Fed has to decrease supply in order to keep the federal funds rate at 2.5%. And so that's what the Fed does on a day-to-day basis. So lots of various things, some longer term, more structural, some day-to-day. People buy more stuff than usual that tends to cause this interest rate to fluctuate. The Fed is always there every day to make sure that the rate stays at its target rate. So what we want to explore next then, so now we kind of understand how this banking system works, how reserves work, and how this federal funds market functions to make sure that banks have sufficient reserves on hand, and how the Fed is effectively manipulating the amount of reserves that banks have available. What we then want to do in the next part here, in Learning Objective 7, is to understand, well, A, how does the Fed control that stuff? How do they move supply around? And sometimes they move demand. And why? So in some sense, what are they ultimately going to use this Fed funds rate for? Why would they set a target? And sometimes they change the target, and we'll try to understand why they would do that.